My name is Chloe, and today is my 27th birthday. What was supposed to be a joyous celebration at one of San Francisco's most luxurious restaurants, with a panoramic view of the Bay Bridge, quickly turned into the most horrifying moment of my life. While my parents, Richard and Eleanor, watched tensely, my billionaire grandfather, Arthur Vance, who rarely appeared at family gatherings, smiled warmly and asked, "Is that apartment in Nob Hill comfortable?" When I replied, "What apartment?" my parents practically died on the spot. Grandfather Arthur's expression changed instantly as he turned to them and asked in a terrifyingly calm tone, "Then where did the money go?" Before everything fell apart that night, I had lived a life I thought was normal. I worked as a graphic designer for a small tech startup in San Francisco's financial district, earning just enough to cover my bills and occasionally treat myself to a nice coffee. My apartment was nothing special, a two-bedroom in a slightly run-down building in the Mission District that I shared with my roommate Maya. The rent was exorbitant, even split in two, but that's life in this city. Still, our place had its charm with mismatched furniture we'd collected over the years and walls covered in art prints and photographs. Despite having a billionaire grandfather, I was proud of standing on my own 2 feet. My parents, Richard and Eleanor Clark, lived a comfortable, upper-class life in Marin County. They had a 5-bedroom house with a pool and took lavish vacations twice a year. I always assumed they were successful because my dad had a senior position at a large insurance company and my mum worked in real estate. They never offered financial help, always emphasizing the importance of working for what you want. 4 years ago, when I graduated from art school with nearly $100,000 in student debt, they congratulated me on taking my first steps into adulthood. While other parents helped their kids with a down payment or covered a few months' rent to get them started, my parents gave me a book on personal finance and said it was important to build character through hardship. I never resented them for it. Not really. I was determined to prove I could make it on my own. But there were times when things got really tight and I wondered why they seemed so reluctant to help, especially when they showed up in a brand new luxury electric car or talked about their plans to remodel their kitchen. Grandfather Arthur was an enigma to me. He had built his massive fortune in Silicon Valley venture capital, starting from nothing and eventually creating one of the most influential investment funds in the world. He was stern, intimidating, and rarely attended family events. When he did show up, everyone tiptoed around him. But despite his gruff exterior, he always had a special soft spot for me. On the rare occasions we spoke, he would ask insightful questions about my design work and genuinely listen to my answers. My cousin Jessica was the only one in our generation who seemed to benefit from the family's wealth. She had a trust fund that afforded her a very comfortable lifestyle, though. She had never worked a day in her life, but constantly posted pictures from exotic locations and high-end restaurants on social media. Whenever we were together at family gatherings, she would talk about her latest shopping spree or vacation in a way that I felt was deliberately designed to highlight the difference in our circumstances. The week before my birthday was particularly awful. The startup I worked for had failed to secure its next round of funding, and I was among the employees who were laid off. With only enough savings to cover about 2 months of expenses, I was panicking about how to pay rent while searching for a new job in a competitive field. When my parents called and insisted on taking me out for a fancy birthday dinner, I tried to decline. I suggested we do something simpler, maybe get takeout at my apartment, but they were adamant, saying 27 was a special birthday and deserved a proper celebration. In hindsight, their insistence now has a twisted meaning. There had been signs that something was wrong. Little things I'd dismissed at the time, like when I mentioned possibly going back to school for a master's degree, and my dad immediately shut down the conversation, saying I already had too much student debt, or the way my mum would quickly change the subject whenever I talked about my financial struggles. There were whispered phone calls that would stop when I entered a room, and a strange tension whenever Grandfather Arthur was mentioned. A few months ago, I had caught my mum looking at properties in Costa Rica online. When I asked if they were planning a vacation, she quickly shut her laptop and said she was just daydreaming. On the evening of my birthday, as I got ready for dinner, Maya helped me put together an outfit that looked nice, but was still within my limited wardrobe. I never would have guessed that in just a few hours, everything I thought I knew about my family would be irrevocably shattered, or that the financial struggles I had faced for years were entirely unnecessary. As I applied my mascara and put on my only decent pair of earrings, I had no idea I was about to discover the most painful betrayal imaginable. The restaurant my parents chose was one of those places where the menus don't have prices, which immediately made me uncomfortable. It was on the top floor of a skyscraper in the financial district, with floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooking a glittering San Francisco Bay. I felt instantly out of place in my simple black dress and the heels I'd worn to job interviews for the past 3 years. My mother was draped in a designer outfit I'd never seen before, with a necklace that probably cost more than my rent. My father wore an expensive suit with gold cufflinks that glinted as he reached for his water glass. The initial conversation felt forced. They asked superficial questions about my job search, but changed the subject whenever I expressed any real concern. Instead, they kept steering the conversation to safe topics. After we ordered, they gave me my gift, a designer wallet and scarf that, while beautiful, seemed strangely modest compared to the restaurant they'd chosen. As I was halfway through my main course, nodding along to another of my dad's stories about his college days, the atmosphere in the restaurant suddenly shifted. People at nearby tables sat up straighter, and the staff became noticeably more attentive. I turned to see what had caused the shift and recognized him immediately. Grandfather Arthur had arrived accompanied by his assistant Jennifer, a sharp woman in her 40s, who was rarely more than a few steps from his side. At 82, Arthur was still an imposing figure, tall and straight-backed with a full head of white hair. He wore a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than my annual salary, and his presence commanded attention without him saying a word. My parents froze mid-conversation, their expressions shifting from surprise to something that looked almost like fear. My dad hastily stood up, nearly knocking over his water glass. "Father, what a surprise," he said, his voice an octave higher than usual. "We weren't sure you'd make it." My grandfather ignored him completely, focusing his attention on me instead. His stern expression softened as he approached our table. "Happy birthday, Chloe," he said, leaning down to kiss my cheek. 27. It's hard to believe how fast the time has gone. "Thank you, Grandpa," I replied, genuinely touched that he'd remembered. "It means a lot that you came." He took the empty seat next to me while Jennifer remained standing, tablet in hand, as if ready to take notes at a moment's notice. "I wanted to check in," he said, studying my face with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Jennifer tells me the quarterly reports for your portfolio are looking good. The trust should be performing well in this market." I blinked in confusion. "Portfolio trust fund?" A small crease appeared between his eyebrows. "Yes, the trust that was set up when you were born. You turned 25 2 years ago, so everything should have been transferred to your control by now." He said it as if it were common knowledge. My parents were suddenly very interested in their plates. My mother's knuckles were white around her fork. "I think there might be some confusion," I said slowly, looking back and forth between my grandfather and my parents. "I don't have a trust fund." Arthur's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. "Of course you do. All your cousins do, though yours was the largest. $5 million initially, plus growth managed by your parents, until your 25th birthday, when control transferred to you." The restaurant around us seemed to fade as I tried to process what he was saying. $5 million, a trust fund I never knew about. It was absurd. "And the apartment in Nob Hill?" Arthur continued, his voice still pleasant. but his eyes were now fixed on my parents. Is it comfortable? I chose that building specifically for the security and the bay views. What apartment? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The silence that followed was deafening. My father had gone pale and my mother looked like she was about to be sick. Arthur's face remained calm, but he now had a dangerous stillness about him, like the moment before a storm breaks. "You don't know about the apartment," he said. "It wasn't a question. The 2-bedroom corner unit in the Lakeside Tower purchased 2 years ago as your 25th birthday present." I shook my head slowly, my mind reeling to make sense of what was happening. Arthur turned to my parents with a deliberate slowness, his voice dropping to a quiet tone that was somehow more frightening than if he had shouted. "Then where did the money go?" My father started to stammer a string of shaky, nonsensical sounds. "Arthur, there's been a misunderstanding. We can explain everything." "I certainly hope so," my grandfather replied, his tone making it clear he didn't believe any explanation would satisfy him. He turned to his assistant. "Jennifer, please call Marcus and have him meet us here immediately." "Already done, sir," Jennifer replied efficiently. "He was having dinner nearby and will be here within 10 minutes. I've also contacted security at the office to pull all relevant financial records." The other diners were now openly staring the drama at our table, clearly more interesting than their expensive meals. A waiter hovered nearby, unsure whether to approach. My mother reached across the table to take my hand, but I pulled back, a wave of nausea rising in my stomach. "Chloe, sweetie, this isn't how we wanted to tell you." "Tell me what?" I demanded, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "That I have a trust fund and an apartment I never knew about, or that you somehow kept them from me." My father looked nervously at the other diners. "This isn't the place for a family discussion." "I agree," Arthur said icily. "Jennifer, please arrange for a private room." He turned back to me, his expression softening slightly. "Chloe, I promise you will have answers tonight. All of them." As Jennifer spoke quietly with the restaurant manager, I sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile the past years of financial struggle with what I had just learned. Why would my parents hide this from me? What had they done with the money that was clearly meant for me, and how could I ever trust them again? The private dining room the restaurant provided had dark wood-panelled walls and a long table that could seat 12, making our small group look even more isolated. Grandfather Arthur sat at the head of the table with me on his right. My parents sat opposite me, both looking like they would rather be anywhere else. Jennifer positioned herself near the door tablet at the ready, her face a professional mask. We were soon joined by Marcus Thorne, my grandfather's longtime lawyer, a bald man with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He carried a leather briefcase that he carefully placed on the table. "I took the liberty of bringing the original trust documents," he said to Arthur, "as well as the most recent financial statements." Arthur nodded. "Good. Let's start from the beginning for Chloe's benefit." Marcus cleared his throat and addressed me directly. "When you were born, your grandfather established a trust in your name with an initial deposit of $5 million. The terms were simple. The fund was to be managed by your parents as trustees until your 25th birthday, at which point control would pass entirely to you. The only stipulations were that money could be used for your education, health, and general welfare before your 25th birthday, with all expenditures documented and approved." I stared at him in disbelief. "And no one thought to tell me about this?" "Your parents were instructed to inform you of the fund when you turned 18, Marcus replied, glancing at my mother and father. "Based on your reaction, I assume that did not happen." "It most certainly did not," Arthur confirmed, his voice tight with controlled anger. "And apparently neither did the transfer of assets at 25. He turned to Marcus. "What is the current value of Chloe's trust?" Marcus pulled a few documents from his briefcase, and laid them on the table. According to the most recent statement from 3 months ago, the fund has grown to approximately 8.5 million. This figure includes the principal plus investment growth minus authorized expenditures for your college tuition and the purchase of the Nob Hill apartment 2 years ago. $8.5 million. The number seemed impossible. While I had been working extra hours and skipping meals to make rent, there had been millions of dollars that belonged to me that were supposed to be used for my benefit. My entire life, the sleepless nights worrying about money, the guilt for not being able to provide better for myself had all been based on a lie. I felt dizzy, the luxurious room starting to spin. $8.5 million. The number repeated in my head each time more absurd. I remembered last week crying in my bathroom after getting the layoff email, terrified of how I would survive. All the while a fortune that could change not just my life, but the lives of anyone I cared about had been sitting there hidden from me by the very people who were supposed to protect me most. I want to see a record of all withdrawals from the trust for the past 7 years, Grandfather Arthur told Marcus, his voice like ice cutting through the suffocating silence. As the lawyer began to arrange more documents, my father finally spoke, his voice laced with desperation. Arthur, we can explain. There were investments that didn't pan out. The money was just temporarily reallocated. Reallocated where exactly? Arthur asked, with a dangerous calm. My mother jumped in, as if she thought her vulnerability might deflect the coming storm. Richard, tell the truth. She turned to Arthur with tears in her eyes. There were some financial difficulties after the 2008 crash. We had to make some adjustments. By stealing from your own daughter. Arthur's voice was razor sharp. It wasn't stealing, my father protested weakly. We're her parents. We were looking out for her best interests. I finally found my voice, a fire of rage erupting from the pit of my shock. By letting me struggle with student loans in a tiny apartment with a roommate while you lived in a 5-bedroom house with a pool. My voice trembled with fury. By watching me stress about paying rent while you bought new cars and took luxury vacations. How exactly was that in my best interest? Jennifer quietly placed a glass of water in front of me. I hadn't realized I was shaking until I tried to pick it up and nearly spilled it. Marcus had been reviewing the financial records with a deepening frown. There appear to be numerous unauthorized withdrawals starting approximately 7 years ago. Large sums transferred to the personal accounts of Richard and Eleanor Clark. He looked up, his expression grim. Based on my preliminary review, it appears that all but approximately $300,000 has been diverted from the trust. The room fell silent. $8.5 million reduced to $300,000. I felt sick. Where is the money now? Arthur asked, his calm voice belying the fury evident in his eyes. My father looked down at his hands. Some of it paid off our mortgage, some for the cars, the home renovations. Investments in Mom's real estate venture, my mother added quietly. The vacations, the house in Lake Tahoe. Memories flashed through my mind, painful in their new context. My parents refusing to help me with a security deposit on my first apartment after graduation, telling me the burden of student loans was good character building. My mother showing off her new Tesla while I was taking the bus to work because I couldn't afford a car payment, all while they had access to millions of dollars that should have been mine. You let me struggle, I said, my voice just a whisper. All those years, all those sleepless nights worrying about money. You saw me working 2 jobs all through college. You saw how stressed I was about getting laid off last week. My voice grew stronger with anger. And you had my money the whole time. You were living off my trust fund while you let me think I had to make it on my own. It wasn't like that, my mother insisted, tears now streaming down her face. We always meant to pay it back. It just got out of control. Out of control, I repeated incredulously. You stole nearly $8 million from me. Grandfather Arthur placed a steadying hand on my arm. Jennifer, please call Detective Miller. I believe he is still with the SFPD's Financial Crimes Unit. Arthur, no. My father cried, panic raw in his voice. There's no need to involve the police. This is a family matter. Theft is a criminal matter, Arthur replied coolly, especially on this scale. Please, my mother begged. We can fix this. We can sell the house, the cars, pay the money back. Arthur looked at me. Chloe, this is ultimately your decision. They stole from you. Whether or not to press charges is your right. I looked across the table at my parents, the people I had trusted implicitly my entire life. The shock was giving way to a profound, aching sense of betrayal that I knew would never fully heal. I saw them not as my parents anymore, but as two strangers who had built their life at my expense. Their luxury was bought with my nights of anxiety. Their comfort was built on my insecurity. I need time to think, I managed to say, my voice breaking. I can't process all of this right now. Arthur nodded a short, sharp gesture. A reasonable request. He turned to Marcus. In the meantime, I want all their assets frozen. Nothing moves without my approval, and I want a full forensic audit of every cent that left that trust. Already initiated, sir, Jennifer said from her post by the door. The team will work through the night if necessary. And the apartment, Marcus asked. Change the locks immediately, Arthur instructed. The new keys are to be delivered only to Chloe. My father made one last, desperate attempt. Arthur, be reasonable. Where will we go? My grandfather stared him down with a look that could freeze fire. You have a 5-bedroom house, bought with stolen money. Enjoy it while you can. The real estate fraud unit will be particularly interested in how a property purchased with trust fund money ended up in your names. The restaurant manager knocked timidly on the door, poking his head in to ask if we needed anything else. The tension in the room was so thick, it seemed to have its own gravity. Just the bill, Arthur said dismissively. We're finished here. As the manager retreated, I looked around the table at the people who were my family and wondered how I had never seen the truth before. My parents, unable to meet my gaze. My grandfather, a solid rock beside me. Jennifer and Marcus, efficient and professional in the face of this family meltdown. Nothing could ever be the same after this night. The foundation of my life had been exposed as a lie, and I had no idea what would be left when the dust settled. The taxi ride home was silent and suffocating. I had refused Arthur's offer to stay at one of his properties. I needed the familiar comfort of my own apartment, however shabby it was. As the cab pulled away, I watched my parents standing frozen on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, suddenly looking small and old under the harsh streetlights. When I walked through the door of my apartment, Maya took one look at my face and knew something was terribly wrong. She guided me to the sofa, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and waited patiently while I struggled to find the words. My parents stole $8 million from me. I finally blurted out the words, sounding absurd even as they left my mouth. I told her everything. The story tumbled out in disjointed pieces, the trust fund I never knew about, the apartment that was supposed to be mine, the years of completely unnecessary financial struggle. As I spoke, the shock began to give way to a deep, bone-marrow anger I had never experienced before. I had to sign up for food stamps last year, I said, my voice breaking. I was eating ramen noodles 4 nights a week to save money, and they were using my trust fund to remodel their kitchen and buy luxury cars. Maya held my hand as I cycled through shock, rage, and grief. At some point she made tea, but it sat untouched on the coffee table, growing cold. My phone buzzed incessantly with texts and calls from my parents, all of which I ignored. The only message I answered was from Arthur, confirming I was safe and asking if I needed anything. The next morning, Jennifer called with an update. Arthur's legal team was moving quickly. They had confirmed that the Lake Tahoe house, my parents' primary residence, and both of their cars had been purchased with money from my trust fund. A forensic accountant was tracking every withdrawal and transfer. The preliminary findings show about $300,000 remaining in the original trust, Jennifer explained efficiently. Most of the funds were used for real estate purchases, luxury items, and several high-risk investments that performed poorly. The following days passed in a blur. I took a break from my job search, unable to focus on anything beyond the immediate crisis. Arthur sent a car each day to take me to meetings with lawyers, financial advisors, and eventually a therapist who specialized in family trauma. A week after my birthday, we learned that my parents had purchased plane tickets to Costa Rica 3 days before my birthday dinner. They had planned to leave the country right after the celebration, apparently realizing that Arthur might uncover their deception at any time. The only reason they hadn't already fled was that they needed to keep up appearances until after my birthday, which they knew Arthur might attend. The betrayal gained a new, more sinister layer. They hadn't just stolen my money. They had planned to run, leaving me to deal with the financial and emotional fallout alone. They had been prepared to effectively erase me from their lives, just to protect their fraudulent lifestyle. The feeling of abandonment was more painful than the financial loss, a deep wound that hollowed me out. The extended family fractured along predictable lines. My father's siblings defended him, suggesting Arthur was overreacting to what they called poor financial management. They called me not to offer comfort, but to persuade me to see reason and not destroy the family over money. Each call was like a knife twisting in the wound, making me realize just how warped their definition of family was. My mother's side was more divided. Aunt Susan, my mum's sister, called me directly, her voice choking on the phone as she apologized for what her sister had done. I always knew Eleanor and Richard were living beyond their means, she confessed, but I never, not for a second, imagined they would do this to you. Her words were a small balm in the storm, a reminder that not everyone in my family had lost their moral compass. The most surprising ally came from my cousin Jessica. She showed up at my apartment unannounced one afternoon, looking uncharacteristically subdued. Her designer handbag looked out of place on my worn-out sofa. I always wondered how Uncle Richard and Aunt Eleanor lived so lavishly when Dad said our trusts were basically equal, she admitted, sitting uncomfortably. I guess now we know why. As it turned out, Jessica's trust had been properly managed, but it was much smaller than mine had been initially. She had been careful with her money spending frugally while projecting a lifestyle on social media that was more glamorous than reality. I was always jealous of how close you seemed to be with your parents, she confessed, a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. My parents were always honest about the money, but they were never really there for me emotionally. I thought you had both loving parents and were just being humble about your wealth. I never imagined they were stealing from you. That conversation was the beginning of an unexpected friendship with my cousin, a bright spot in the darkness that had enveloped my life. For the first time, we weren't competitors in some unspoken family race. We were just two young women trying to navigate a complicated family. The legal proceedings moved forward relentlessly. Arthur's team discovered that only about $300,000 remained of my original trust. The rest had been spent on my parents' extravagant lifestyle or lost in bad investments. The Lake Tahoe house and their primary residence in Marin were both seized as they were purchased directly with trust money. The cars, the boat my father rarely used, my mother's extensive jewellery collection, it was all documented and appraised for potential recovery. Throughout it all, my parents continued their desperate attempts to contact me. The messages shifted from attempts at explanation to outright begging as the legal consequences became clear. My father called from a cheap motel, lamenting that they had nowhere else to go. My mother sent long, rambling emails about how everything they did was ultimately for my benefit, though she could never quite explain how their luxury lifestyle had helped me. The media eventually caught wind of the story. A business publication ran a small article about investment tycoon Arthur Vance's family financial dispute. While they didn't name me, the article hinted at significant trust fund misappropriation by close family members. I deleted all my social media accounts temporarily, unable to face questions from acquaintances who might connect the dots. The worst part was the persistent, gnawing guilt that plagued me, even though I was the victim. Had I somehow pushed my parents to this? Should I have realised something was wrong? Was I overreacting by allowing Arthur's legal team to pursue them so aggressively? The therapist Arthur had arranged for me explained that this was a common reaction for victims of familial betrayal, but understanding the psychology didn't make the feelings any less real. 3 weeks into this fog of legal meetings and emotional turmoil, Arthur invited me to dinner at his penthouse, overlooking the Golden Gate Park. The space was surprisingly warm and comfortable despite its obvious luxury. He mixed drinks for us himself, having given the staff the evening off so we could have privacy. "I want you to know that none of this is your fault," he said, looking at me directly. "Your parents made their choices. They didn't just betray you, they betrayed the trust I placed in them." "I just keep thinking I should have known," I admitted, my voice hoarse. "There were signs." "You had no reason to suspect your own parents of stealing from you," Arthur replied firmly, "especially when you didn't even know the money existed." That night, Arthur showed me photos I had never seen before. My grandmother, who passed away when I was too young to remember, a young Arthur building his first venture, my mother as a little girl sitting on Arthur's shoulders at a park. "Family is a complicated thing," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "Your grandmother and I didn't always see eye to eye on how to raise your mother. I was often too strict, too focused on building my career. Perhaps, if I had been different, your mother might have developed a healthier relationship with money." It was the closest I had ever seen my grandfather come to vulnerability, and it helped me begin to understand that the betrayal had layers that extended beyond my own pain. My parents hadn't just stolen from me. They had betrayed the father who had tried to secure his granddaughter's future. For the first time, I saw a crack in his steel armour, an acknowledgement of his own role in the complex tapestry that led to this collapse. A month after my birthday, I finally agreed to see my parents. The legal mediation was scheduled at Arthur's lawyer's office, a sleek space in a downtown skyscraper that made my parents look even more out of place than I felt. They had aged visibly in the past month. My father's face was gaunt with dark circles under his eyes. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her purse. They wore clothes I didn't recognize, much plainer than their usual attire. I learned later they had been forced to sell most of their designer wardrobe. The conference room felt intimidatingly large for our small group. Arthur sat beside me, along with Marcus and 2 other lawyers from his team. My parents had a single, nervous-looking attorney who kept shuffling his papers. The forensic auditing team presented their findings with cold precision. Charts and graphs detailed the systematic draining of my trust over 7 years. What started as small borrowings had escalated into massive withdrawals. The money had funded the purchase of homes, cars, lavish vacations, my mother's failed attempt to start a high-end real estate firm, and my father's disastrous foray into day trading. As the evidence mounted, my father's posture grew increasingly defensive, while my mother simply stared at the table, occasionally wiping away a tear. When the presentation concluded, Arthur addressed my parents directly. "The forensic audit is complete. We know exactly where every dollar went. The only question that remains is whether this proceeds as a civil matter or whether criminal charges will be filed." My parents' lawyer cleared his throat. "My clients are prepared to cooperate fully. They understand the gravity of their actions and wish to make amends to the extent possible." "Amends?" I repeated, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. You stole my future. You watched me struggle while you lived on money that was supposed to be mine. How exactly do you plan to make amends for that? My father couldn't meet my eyes. Chloe, we never meant for it to go this far. It started small, just borrowing a little to get through a tough patch. And then it got easier to take a little more and a little more, my mother added quietly. We convinced ourselves we deserved it, for raising you, for all the sacrifices we made as parents. We told ourselves we'd pay it back before you ever needed to know. And the apartment? I asked. The one Grandpa bought for me 2 years ago. What was your plan there? They exchanged guilty looks. My father sighed heavily. We rented it out. The income was deposited into our accounts. The betrayal felt fresh all over again. While I was sharing a cramped apartment with a roommate, they had been collecting rent from a luxury property that was supposed to be mine. A feeling of disgust rose in my throat. Arthur placed a steadying hand on my shoulder before addressing my parents. Here are your options. Option 1, you sign over all remaining assets purchased with trust money, cooperate fully with recovery efforts, and agree to a structured repayment plan for what cannot be immediately recovered. In return, Chloe agrees not to press criminal charges. My parents nodded eagerly. Option 2, Arthur continued, his voice hardening. You continue to obfuscate and defend your actions, in which case we will proceed with criminal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and grand theft. The evidence is irrefutable. You will both face significant prison time. We'll take option 1, my father said quickly. We'll cooperate completely. Arthur looked at me. Chloe, the decision is yours. I studied my parents. The people who had raised me, who had tucked me in at night and cheered at my graduations. The same people who had systematically stolen my inheritance while watching me struggle. The conflicting emotions were overwhelming. Part of me wanted to see them pay for the pain they had caused, wanted them to feel a fraction of the loss and fear I had endured. But another part, the part that still remembered my mother's hugs, and my father's advice, recoiled at the thought of sending them to prison. I don't want them to go to jail, I said finally, my voice raw. But I want every cent that can be recovered, and I want them to acknowledge exactly what they did, not just to me, but to the family. The legal details were ironed out over the next few hours. My parents signed document after document, relinquishing assets and agreeing to the terms Arthur's team had outlined. By the end of the day, I was the legal owner of their Lake Tahoe house, which would be sold, and arrangements were in place to seize as many of their assets as possible for liquidation. When the lawyers stepped out to make copies, I found myself alone with my parents for the first time since my birthday. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken things. Why? I asked simply. I just want to understand how you could do this. My mother reached for my hand, and this time I didn't pull away. We got caught up in a lifestyle we couldn't really afford, she said, her voice breaking. Your father made some bad investments early in our marriage, and we were always trying to catch up to keep up appearances. When we had access to your fund, it seemed like an easy solution, just a little to get us over the hump, but it never stopped. We have a problem with money, my father admitted, looking truly ashamed for the first time. With spending, with status, we need help. Professional help. That doesn't excuse what we did to you, but maybe it helps to explain it. It wasn't enough. No explanation ever could be. But it was a start, a small crack in the wall of betrayal that stood between us. 2 weeks later, I moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment purchased with a portion of the recovered funds. It wasn't the luxury property in Nob Hill that was supposed to be mine, but it was mine free and clear with no mortgage or rent to worry about. It was in a quiet neighborhood in Noe Valley with large windows that looked out onto a tree-lined street. Arthur had helped me choose it, insisting on its security features and good location near public transit. For the first time since graduation, I felt a sense of fundamental security, knowing I had a place to come home to, a sanctuary that wasn't dependent on my next paycheck or the whims of the San Francisco rental market was like taking a deep breath after years of holding it in. With Arthur's guidance, I began to learn about financial management, the recovered assets, which included the sale of the Lake Tahoe house and various liquidated holdings, amounted to a little over $1 million, a fraction of what the trust should have been worth, but still a life-changing sum for someone who had been living paycheck to paycheck. "This isn't a gift, Chloe," Arthur told me during one of our sessions at his office, where stock market charts glowed on the screens. "This is restitution. It's getting back what's yours. Now our job is to make sure it grows." A new job opportunity came through one of Arthur's connections, a position at a prestigious design firm with a better salary and more potential for growth than my previous job. Though I was initially hesitant to accept help that felt like nepotism, Arthur pointed out that all he had done was get me the interview. Landing the position was entirely my achievement, and I did. In the interview, I presented my portfolio with a newfound confidence fueled by a sense of self-worth that was no longer tied to my financial struggles. As spring turned to summer, I began to establish new routines and boundaries. I allowed limited contact with my parents, accepting brief phone calls, but declining their requests to visit. They had moved into a small rental apartment, and both were in therapy for financial addiction, a term I had never heard before, but which seemed to accurately describe their behaviour. I kept a safe distance, not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. The wound was still too fresh to bear proximity. Arthur and I grew closer, our weekly dinners becoming a fixture in my week. He taught me about investing and business with the same precision and attention to detail that had made him so successful. I began to see past his gruff exterior to the complex, thoughtful man beneath. We talked about everything from macroeconomic policy to his memories of my grandmother. In these conversations, I filled in the gaps in my family's story, understanding the pressures and ambitions that had shaped not only his life but my mother's as well. Jennifer, surprisingly, became a friend too. Having worked for Arthur for over 15 years, she had stories about him that humanized him in ways I never expected. She also proved to be an excellent mentor for professional growth, helping me navigate office politics and career planning with her characteristic efficiency. "Arthur sees potential in people," she told me over coffee one day, "especially in you." The most unexpected development was the reappearance of Ethan, a friend from college I had lost touch with. He had reached out after seeing me in a coffee shop near my new apartment, and our reconnection felt like finding an anchor in a stormy sea. Ethan was a software engineer, calm and grounded, a complete contrast to the chaos of my life. He had no connection to my family drama, no preconceived notions of who I should be. With him, I could just be Chloe, not the victim of a sensational family betrayal. We hiked in Muir Woods, explored bookstores in Haight-Ashbury, and talked for hours about books, technology, and our hopes for the future. He was a reminder that there was a world outside my bubble of pain, a world where trust could be given freely and without fear. As summer faded into fall, I started to feel something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just hope for financial stability, but hope for rebuilding a life that was truly my own, founded on truth instead of deception. I was laying the bricks of a new foundation, one that wasn't inherited, but built piece by piece with my own hands. 6 months after the revelation that changed everything, I found myself thriving in ways I could never have predicted. My position at the design firm had grown from a basic graphic design role to leading a small team on a major rebranding project for a national client. The creative director had taken notice of my work and increasingly sought my input on key projects. For the first time in my career, I felt like I was not just an executor, but a voice, a true creator. Arthur had helped me establish a solid financial foundation with the recovered funds. The approximately 1.2 million had been carefully invested, with a portion set aside for immediate security. I now had a retirement account, real health insurance that covered more than catastrophic emergencies, and an emergency fund that could sustain me for a full year if needed. For someone who had spent years counting every penny and worrying about unexpected expenses, this security was almost disorienting. I still found myself hesitating before making simple purchases, the habit of financial anxiety deeply ingrained despite my changed circumstances. My parents continued to grapple with the consequences of their actions. They were forced to downsize significantly, moving from the 5-bedroom house to a small 2-bedroom apartment in a modest neighborhood. My father had taken a position at a smaller insurance firm, several rungs below his previous executive role. My mother had relinquished her real estate license as part of the legal settlement and was working as an administrative assistant. The social fallout was perhaps the hardest adjustment for them. Old friends had distanced themselves as the story circulated through their social circles. They were no longer invited to the country club events and charity galas that had once been the centerpiece of their social calendar. After months of limited contact, I had agreed to meet them for coffee at a neutral location. They arrived early, clearly nervous, bearing no gifts or offers beyond their apparent desire to reconnect. "We've been working with our therapist on making amends," my mother explained, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee mug. "Not just to you, but to Grandpa, to ourselves. We're setting up boundaries with money," my father added. "Separate accounts, strict budgets, accountability partners. It's like being in recovery from any other addiction." I listened more than I spoke, observing the changes in them. There was a humility that hadn't been there before, an absence of the designer labels and status symbols that had once seemed so essential to their identity. Before we parted, my mother hesitantly asked if we could make contact a regular thing, perhaps a monthly lunch. I agreed to consider it, unwilling to commit, but no longer completely closed off to the possibility of a carefully constructed relationship. Arthur had a minor health scare in the early fall, a warning from his doctor about his blood pressure that led to lifestyle changes and a reduced work schedule. The brush with his own mortality softened him further, making him more reflective about family ties, despite the pain of the betrayal. "Your grandmother always said family was worth fighting for," he told me during one of our weekly dinners. "Not worth sacrificing your self-respect or your safety for, but worth the effort of understanding and forgiveness where possible." I was learning from Arthur not just about financial management, but about resilience in the face of betrayal. He had been deeply wounded by my parents' actions, yet he maintained a steadfast presence in my life, never letting his disappointment in them colour his relationship with me. With Arthur's encouragement, I had started a small side business in graphic design consulting, working with startups that couldn't afford full-service agencies. The work was challenging and rewarding, allowing me to build something that was entirely my own, independent of family connections or recovered funds. My confidence grew not just professionally, but personally. The therapy sessions that had started as crisis management had evolved into a valuable tool for examining patterns and building healthier relationships. I was learning to trust my own judgment again, to recognize that I was a victim not because of any failure on my part, but because the people I trusted had made terrible choices. An unexpected development came in the form of a surprise dinner arranged by Arthur 6 months to the day from my fateful birthday. He had booked a private dining room at a restaurant even more exclusive than the one where our family had imploded. But this time the atmosphere was completely different. When I arrived, I found not only Arthur, but Jennifer Marcus, my cousin Jessica, and even Ethan all gathered to celebrate what Arthur called my half-birthday. 6 months ago, your life was upended in ways no one could have anticipated, Arthur said, raising a glass for a toast. Tonight, we celebrate not what was lost, but what you have built from the ashes. After dinner, Arthur presented me with a small box. Inside was a key and the deed to a new, modest apartment, but in a secure building with a short commute. The Nob Hill property was sold as part of the recovery effort, he explained. This one is yours outright, purchased with recovered funds, but chosen specifically for the life you are living now. Not the one that was taken from you. The gesture brought me to tears, not because of the material value, but because it represented a clean break from the past, a fresh start, untainted by betrayal. My relationship with Jessica had grown from a cautious connection to a genuine friendship. Freed from the false competition that had defined our previous interactions, we discovered shared interests and complementary personalities. She was practical and business-minded, while I was more creative and idealistic. She even invested in my side business, providing capital for expansion in exchange for a modest stake, a deal that Arthur helped structure to ensure fairness for both of us. "I always thought you had the perfect family," she confessed over one of our lunches. "It's so strange how we were both jealous of each other for things that weren't even real." "Maybe now we can build something that is," I replied, and I meant it. Ethan had become more than a friend in the intervening months. Our coffee meetups had evolved into dinner dates and long conversations that often lasted late into the night. He had been present through the worst of the fallout without trying to fix or diminish my pain, simply offering steady support and an occasional much-needed distraction. He was my solid ground in a world that still felt precarious. When he kissed me for the first time during a walk along the waterfront near my new apartment, it felt like stepping across a threshold into a part of my life that was untouched by the betrayal. This was something entirely new, a relationship built on a foundation of honesty from the start. He knew my story, all of it, but he saw me not as a victim to be saved, but as a survivor he admired. With my newfound financial stability, I felt a strong urge to pay it forward. I had begun using a portion of my recovered funds to establish a small mentorship program for young designers from disadvantaged backgrounds, providing scholarships for software training and professional development. The program was still in its infancy, but helping others who faced financial barriers to pursuing a creative career provided a sense of purpose that transcended my personal experience. It was my way of turning pain into power loss, into a legacy. The money could be taken, but the knowledge and opportunity I could provide for others were assets that could not be stolen. As fall turned to winter, I realized that while the betrayal would always be a part of my story, it no longer defined my daily existence. I was building something new, something authentic from painful truths rather than comfortable lies. I was redefining success on my own terms, not by my bank balance, but by the depth of my relationships, the integrity of my work, and the positive impact I could make. I realized that the greatest betrayal was not that my parents took my money, it was that they stole from me my belief in the most basic foundations of life, that family was a safe harbor, that love was unconditional, that I was worthy of honesty. The real journey was not in recovering the money, but in reclaiming those beliefs, not naively, but with a deeper, harder-won wisdom. I was learning to trust again, starting with the people who had proven themselves trustworthy: Arthur, Jessica, Jennifer, Ethan. And most importantly, I was learning to trust myself, to trust my resilience, to trust my judgment, and to trust my ability to create a meaningful life from the wreckage of the past. 1 year after the birthday that changed everything, I found myself in a place I never could have imagined. Not just financially secure, but emotionally stronger, with clearer boundaries and deeper, more authentic relationships than I had before the betrayal. The healing journey had not been linear. There were still days when the anger would surface unexpectedly, when the memory of those years of unnecessary struggle felt fresh and raw. But those moments now came less frequently, overshadowed by the full life I was building. My parents and I had established a cautious process of reconciliation. We met monthly for lunch with clear boundaries and expectations. They had shown genuine remorse, continuing with therapy and making the small but consistent restitution payments that Arthur's team had structured as part of their amends process. I never thought I would sit at a table with them again without feeling rage. I admitted to my therapist during one of our bi-weekly sessions, "It isn't forgetting or even full forgiveness, but it's something like peace." The financial education Arthur had provided transformed my relationship with money. I now managed my investments with confidence, understanding the balance between security and growth. The remaining trust fund, though much smaller than it should have been, was carefully managed to provide long-term stability while allowing me to live comfortably in the present. Arthur had another health scare more serious than the first, requiring a brief hospitalization. The fragility of his mortality brought a new perspective to our family situation. Despite the betrayal, despite the legal consequences, he was still my grandfather and my mother's father. The time we had together was finite and precious, even with the shadow of past actions. During his recovery, I spent hours at his bedside learning more about his early years, his relationship with my grandmother, his regrets and his triumphs. These conversations deepened my understanding not only of him, but of the complex family dynamics that had contributed to, though never excused, my parents' actions. My design career had blossomed, with my side business growing to the point where I was considering whether to pursue it full-time. I had hired 2 junior designers to help with the growing client load, and a business manager to handle the administrative aspects I was less interested in. The mentorship program had also expanded with 5 young designers now receiving scholarships and professional guidance. Watching them grow in confidence and skill brought a satisfaction unlike anything I had experienced in my previous career. Ethan and I had grown even closer. Our relationship was built on a foundation of transparency that I now realized had been missing from most of my previous relationships, both familial and romantic. He had his own apartment, but spent most nights at my place, our lives blending together in a way that felt natural and unforced. "You know what amazes me most about you," he said one evening as we cooked dinner together in my kitchen, "how you took something that could have made you bitter and turned it into growth." The apartment had truly become my home, filled with art and books that reflected my interests, decorated in colours that brought me joy. It was modest compared to what might have been mine if the trust had remained intact, but it was wholly mine in a way the Nob Hill property never could have been. On the anniversary of the revelation, I hosted a small gathering at my apartment. Arthur was there, looking frailer than I wanted to admit, but still as sharp as ever. Jessica and Ethan, Jennifer, and a few close friends from work. Conspicuously absent were my parents, not because they weren't invited, but because they had come to recognize that this particular milestone was not one they should be a part of. As we ate together around my dining table, I looked at the people who had become my chosen family and felt a wave of gratitude that almost overwhelmed me. "A year ago, I thought my life was ruined," I said, raising my glass for a toast. "What I've learned since then is that when the foundation is exposed as false, you get the chance to build something true in its place." Arthur nodded in approval, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "To the truth," he said simply, raising his glass to touch mine. "To the truth," the others echoed. Later, after the guests had gone, and it was just Ethan helping me load the dishwasher in comfortable silence, I reflected on the deeper lessons of the past year. I had learned that financial wealth, while providing security and opportunity, was not the most valuable currency. Trust, authenticity, and self-awareness were far more precious and far harder to rebuild once broken. I had learned that forgiveness was not a single act, but a process, one that did not require forgetting or excusing, but that eventually led to a lightening of the burden of anger. Most importantly, I had learned that while we cannot choose what happens to us, We have complete control over how we respond, over what we build from both the gifts and the wreckage. The betrayal would always be a part of my story, a chapter I could not erase. But it would not be the defining chapter, only the one that forced me to take control of the narrative and write the rest with intention and authenticity. Sometimes the most painful truths are the ones that finally set us free.